Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. This is the Pearl Harbor Memorial in Hawaii live stream history tour. Thanks so much for being here. Let's go ahead and get started. So, Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, was 82 years ago. So, we're having our third annual virtual or online history tour of the Pearl Harbor Memorial in Hawaii. If you missed us last night, we screened the film Tora, Tora, Tora. If you missed us, we won't probably be screening that again until next year. You can always check it out on your own. Tora, Tora, Tora. Really excellent film. It talks a lot or shows a lot of the historical developments that take place in the events leading up to the Battle of Pearl Harbor. My name is Robert Kelleman. I'll be your host. A little bit about myself. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. I lived in Southern California and Washington, D.C. for many, many years before ending up here in Dallas, Texas. I'm a big history buff. And my favorite historical site, I'm going to go with the Battle of Gettysburg site because we had a series of programs on that last summer, and Gettysburg is a really fascinating place to visit. If you get a chance and you're in Dallas, Texas, you should come visit us in person. Myself and some others with our group Dallas, Texas History and Culture. We promote a lot or post a lot of free tours throughout the Dallas Fort Worth area, and you can find us on Eventbrite, Facebook, Meetup, or YouTube. Most recently, we had a bunch of tours and events related to the John F. Kennedy assassination. If you're in Dallas and familiar with the area, we're going to the Fort Worth Stockyards next Saturday. The Saturday after that, we're going to go see the Christmas lights in Grapevine. Let's see, in early January, we're doing an art and architecture walk in downtown Dallas. So you can come check that out. But if you're in Washington, D.C., I hope you get a chance to check out my good friend Harry Phillips is hosting a really cool tour on figures and people that were involved in World War II at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. And that's taking place next Sunday, December 10th at, I believe, 1 p.m. Hopefully I got that correct, Harry.
Yes, that is correct.
And here is Harry himself. Hi, Harry. You want to say hello and introduce yourself and maybe tell people a little about your upcoming tour?
Uh, yes, I'm calling in from Northern Virginia. I'm about 20 miles outside of Washington, D.C. And I met Robert about 8 years ago, and he got me inspired to start giving tours, um, which I started at Arlington National Cemetery, and that's where I developed a very keen interest in American military biography and history. And so this tour that's coming up is going to be at the National Portrait Gallery. And what I discovered was that they have a huge collection of portraits there, including you see some of the famous military leaders from the Second World War. And we'll be looking at, I don't know, maybe close to 40 or 50 portraits. It turns out that they have the President's Gallery there, and President Roosevelt and Truman were the two commander-in-chief presidents for the Second World War. The next 8 presidents all served in some capacity during the war. And so we'll spend some time in the President's Gallery and talking about those men who served in the military during the war before they became president.
Oh, that's really cool, Harry. Good idea. Well, thank you. Let's see. So, for people that aren't familiar with the Smithsonian Portrait Gallery, like where is it at? What's the story on it? I know where it's at, but for people maybe that are listening that are in Washington D.C. that because it's not on the National Mall, it's downtown.
No, that's right. It's at what, 8th and F Street,
Mm.
um, downtown. It's in the what's referred to as the Chinatown district. It's right across the street from the basketball and hockey arena down in Washington. Yeah, 8th and G Street. And it's an old building that has been renovated. It used to be the patent office, and now since the mid '60s has housed the National Portrait Gallery and the Smithsonian American Art Museum.
Okay. Well, awesome, Harry. We'll have to can you post a link in the Zoom chat or I'll post the link and I'll also email out the link for anyone that's interested in joining Harry. That should be fabulous. So thank you so much, Harry. Appreciate that. And we also have our good friend Patty joining us from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Hi, Patty. You want to say hello? And what's your favorite historical site?
Well, it's interesting that you said Gettysburg, Robert, because I was in the process of typing that Civil War battlefields have long been among my favorite historical places to visit, partly just because I've always been trying to understand the ways and manners in which American citizens with so much in common, came to visiting deadly war in each other. I really have a hard time getting my head around that. So yeah, that's always been one of my favorites. And Harry, you've got me thinking about these next state presidents. I'm curious, do you mean were in some way engaged in military service or had peripheral sometimes roles? Because I'm trying to think of Reagan.
Yeah, so he was in the Army, maybe the Army or Army Air Corps, and working. I think he was working on films for the military. So
Oh, I
so
think
yeah,
you're right.
um, so yeah, he everyone actually, all eight presidents actually, were on active duty at some point during the war years.
Very interesting. Both of you always make me wish I lived somewhat closer to DC. So I enjoy all of the things you teach us. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you. And then two of the presidents almost got killed. John F. Kennedy and George Bush Sr. almost got killed during World War II. Actually, Gerald Ford did also. He almost got swept off the aircraft carrier, I think it was. He said in his autobiography. So anyway, we'll talk more about that later. We also have our friend Brad joining us from West Virginia. And Brad, tell us what your favorite historical site is. And also, if you don't mind, you have a really interesting personal connection to Pearl Harbor.
Well, yes. Good morning, everybody. This is Brad. I was born in Connecticut and I have migrated down to West Virginia. And I guess I would have to say my favorite historical site is the original Plymouth Rock and the Plymouth Plantations in Massachusetts. It's really, takes us back to the roots of our country. And my personal connection is that if at the start of World War II, we didn't have very many Americans who spoke Japanese. So both my parents were in the Navy and went to University of Colorado for a year and became linguists and learned Japanese. And had there not been this war and this attack, I might not be here. So I can't imagine that a lady from Western or Southern California or Northern California would meet a guy from Connecticut. But they met, and the rest is history.
Oh, well, that's cool. Really fascinating personal connection to the war. Well, thanks, Brad. Thanks for joining us. And of course, also to thanks, Patty, and thanks, Harry. All right, let's go ahead and get started. This is the Pearl Harbor Memorial in Hawaii. This
I,
is like
I,
a,
have,
a virtual tour. What was that?
I have a personal question for Harry. Is his thing going to be virtual or in person only?
Oh, in person.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know, Harry. Maybe someday you can do an online virtual version.
Yeah, actually, this program would lend itself to doing that. So maybe that's something I should work on.
All right, good idea. Thanks, Brad. All right, let's go ahead and get started. This again, Pearl Harbor Memorial. All right, so let's talk about some things that led up to the attack. So a lot of people would like to visit the Pearl Harbor Memorial, or maybe they're planning a trip. So I thought I'd kind of go over some things maybe to consider if you're planning a trip there, or if you want to visit at some point in time in the future. But before we get to the actual Pearl Harbor site, let's kind of talk about maybe some brief historical context and how things end up playing out. Okay, so here is Japan, our geography lesson for today. And before Pearl Harbor, when Japan studies the landscape of their neighbors in Asia, what they noticed is that a lot of these territories are controlled by other countries, in particular non-Asian countries. So you can see Great Britain in yellow. This is their empire. The Netherlands is down here, their empire. France controlled Vietnam during this point in time and some other areas. Then you have the United States, they're in control of the Philippines, Russia, et cetera, et cetera. And Japan's looking around saying, hey, why do all these other countries get to take over areas and places? We should have a similar type of situation. Why don't we take over some places too? And so that was really kind of the impetus of them trying to expand their empire into other places, because they had seen all these other countries do that. And it was particularly interesting for them because these other countries were non-Asian countries that were taking over places in Asia. And so Japan's military goes off on an expansion campaign, and they're going to start taking over all these different places. Now, this is on September 1st, 1939, which a lot of people kind of consider the official start date of World War II, because that's when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. And there was a lot of events, though, taking place before that point in time. So Japan had taken over all these different territories. They moved into Manchuria. They'd previously taken over Korea, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're expanding their empire. And eventually that's going to cause some issues. Of course, at the same time, Germany is expanding, Nazi Germany is expanding their empire into different parts of Europe. And as all this starts taking place, at this point in time, the United States isn't involved militarily against Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany. However, they're trying to do different diplomatic things. So this is an interesting headline from the New York Times. You can see this is September 27th, 1940. So about 15 months before Pearl Harbor. U.S. embargoes scrap iron hitting Japan, et cetera, et cetera. And then there also were going to be oil restrictions and things like that. So here's a political cartoon of the day, and here's a Japanese caricature and their war machine, and it's going to be showing that the United States is going to be cutting off the oil supply because Japan does not have much of an oil supply. And then this isn't the greatest chart to read, but it does show this matrix of the impact of the embargo on Japan. So if you look at petroleum, this is the total Japanese imports of petroleum by year. And then this is the total from the US. So in 1937, they were getting a lot. By the time 1941 rolled around, not really all that much, particularly from the US. Same thing with steel. You can see the steel imports dropped off dramatically. And from the US, it pretty much dropped off to nothing. And then the same thing with scrap iron. So all these different materials that Japan needed, petroleum, steel, scrap iron, etc., had a dramatic drop off in the months and years leading up to Pearl Harbor. And so let's talk a little bit more about Imperial Japan. So they end up retaliating against this with the attack on Pearl Harbor, thinking if they can, knock the United States out, they can go get these materials, the petroleum, the steel, and the scrap iron from other places, but they'll have to expand their empire to do that. And they know the United States is not going to be okay with that. And so they thought, you know what, proactively we'll attack Pearl Harbor, we'll knock the Americans out of our way, so to speak, and then we'll continue on doing what we want to do. And so that's what ends up happening. So they attack Pearl Harbor. And this is a map kind of post Pearl Harbor. So this is the Japanese expansion in 1942. So they were initially very, very successful. They took over large sections of the Asia Pacific region. Pearl Harbor is over here. They never actually took over that area. They just attacked it on December 7th. But you can see they very impressively took over a very large section of Asia after the attack on Pearl Harbor. All right, let's talk about Pearl Harbor itself. So some numbers about the American losses on Pearl Harbor. So there were 4 battleships sunk. There were 4 battleships damaged. There were 2 other ships lost. There were 8 other ships damaged. 188 aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. There were another 159 aircraft that were damaged. The casualties, 2,335 military personnel were killed, and then another 1,143 military personnel were wounded. Some people don't realize there were quite a few civilian casualties during the attack on Pearl Harbor. 68 civilians were killed and 35 civilians were wounded. So before we get too much further in the program, let's check back in with Harry. Harry, anything to add on the events leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor?
No, I mean, just, from a sort of inside the US point of view, a lot of people, Roosevelt had been pushing very hard to support Britain before the attack on Pearl Harbor, but there was a lot of reluctance among Americans to get involved in another world war. And a lot of that had to do with what had happened at the end of the First World War, where Wilson had promised to make the world safe for democracy, and a lot of people saw the rise of Hitler in Germany as not being that, right? And so there was, people were discouraged and thinking, well, what's the use of another war? And it's really the attack on Pearl Harbor, which apparently Germany had no idea was taking place, that really changed everything, and threw America into the war, and sort of silenced all the people who said we shouldn't get involved.
Yeah, what about Patty? If you don't mind, yesterday, right before the Tora movie, you were talking about the isolationism. Would you be able to repeat your comment? Because I thought it was really insightful.
Well, that has been a long theme throughout American history, sometimes more obvious than others. But if you are aware of that and you trace that through your study of American history, that is among the dominant populist themes in American history, is this idea of isolationism. And of course, before the air war became so predominant, we could afford this kind of fantasy that, well, who's going to attack us? We've got the oceans on all sides. But of course, World War II marked the definitive turning point of like, oh, see, you are part of the world after all. So, yeah, I don't think we've ever actually resolved that instinct toward isolationism. I think that's part of what is in the mix of things going on right now, but I don't know that we've ever figured out somewhere else to, or some other way to resolve that sense of we just want to be alone, which again is part of that theme. We want to be alone, right? I mean, so yeah, I am always interested in the insights Harry brings to this, and you as well, Robert, and anybody else. It's always interesting to see the comments that come in as we're doing these programs.
Oh, thanks, Patty. I appreciate that. What about Brad? I just was curious to go back to your personal story. What was your parents doing before the attack on Pearl Harbor? Were they already in the Navy, or had they joined it beforehand? If you don't mind, I'm just kind of curious how that all played out.
Now, my mother, believe this or not, was getting a master's degree in German at Yale University, and then the war started. My dad was working for a small steel company in Connecticut, and he signed up originally to join the V-12 program, where you got a little education in the sciences and then became a naval line officer. But he was diverted into this language program based on his academic record. And
Oh, my,
I agree with the isolationism. And if you think back a couple of hundred years, I think Japan took it to a far greater degree than we did.
yeah, they did. It was a very closed off from the rest of the world of society for a long time.
But they certainly got out of that habit.
Oh yeah, making up for lost time. So, okay. So anyway, here's the statistics again. I would think maybe most people have heard of Pearl Harbor. Maybe some people don't know the devastation that was done and the impact, both military and civilian. So there's the stats for that. What about the Japanese? They had some losses as well. They lost 4 midget submarines that were sunk. Another one was grounded. They had 29 aircraft were shot down and destroyed. There was another 74 aircraft that were damaged. They did suffer some losses. 64 of the air crew were killed, and then a sailor from one of the submarines was captured. So that was their losses. And then if you're not familiar with Hawaii, here is Pearl Harbor. And why is it called Pearl Harbor? Well, because it's shaped like a pearl. Of course, it's on the south side of the island. And then here's another view. So the reason why Pearl Harbor was so important to the United States, it was a really great place to have ships based out of, because look at all this water that you can use, and there's all these ships here. The Arizona Memorial is essentially right here. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That's the most famous part of the Pearl Harbor site. But you can see the ships could come in and out through this channel, and then here is the Pacific Ocean out here. So a really great position militarily for a country to have. And then here's a aerial view. So I'll show you some different kind of high level shots just so you can kind of get the overall context of the site. So here's the Arizona Memorial, the USS Arizona Memorial. And then next to it is the USS Missouri. And you can see the beauty of Hawaii. And then here's another view. So interestingly enough, the Missouri is where Japan surrendered to the Allies to end the Pacific portion of World War II. The surrender terms were actually signed on the battleship Missouri, which was anchored off of Tokyo Bay after the atomic bombs dropped. So if you go to the site, you can kind of see the beginning of the war through the Arizona and other sites, and then all the way up through the end of the war with the USS Missouri. And here's another view. I actually have a personal connection to the USS Missouri. My uncle, my dad's father, who I'm named after, he served on the USS Missouri after World War II. All right, let's talk about some of the sites that are related to Pearl Harbor. There's more than one place to go visit if you want to see all the things that took place at Pearl Harbor. It's not just like you show up, there's one spot, you go see it and go home. I mean, you can do that, but there's a number of sites, and some of them are a little bit spread out. It probably would take like a whole entire day to see the sites and do them their justice. But let's go through some of these different places. You can kind of get familiar with where they are and what they're all about. The first one was known back then as Hickam Field. It's now called Hickam Air Force Base. And at this location, there were 182 members of the U.S. Army Air Force that were killed. At this point in time, the Air Force wasn't a separate group. It was part of the U.S. Army, so that's the name U.S. Army Air Force. And again, just orient yourself. Here's the Arizona, here's the Missouri, there's a few other military things, and then Hickam is over here. So it's a little ways away from Arizona. And then here it is in the World War II era. And so you can see a big airfield, the beautiful mountains of Hawaii, and look at the tiny ships. These are actually very large ships, but they look small because of the aerial photo. And this is where a lot of damage and destruction took place. So you can see this plane has been destroyed. The gentleman over here lost his hat. And some more of the destruction. And kind of amazing to think that all this damage was caused by 1941 era airplanes, because airplanes back then, while they were pretty potent, nowhere nearly as potent as they are today. But the planes came in, dropped different types of bombs, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and did all this damage and destruction. And Hickam is still used today. There's a more recent photo. And at this point in time, December 7th, 1941, this is the Pacific Air Force's headquarters building. And the historical marker says on December 7th, 1941, this building was a 3,002-man barracks, the largest in the Army Air Forces. During the attack that morning, scores of airmen perished. The shrapnel and bullet holes were left as a silent symbol of the sacrifice by those who gave their lives. So they actually still have the damage to the building. You can see some of it here. I'll show you a little bit better photo in just a moment. These walls also remind us the need to remain ever vigilant in defense of our nation and our way of life. In 1985, the U.S. Department of the Interior designated a portion of Hickam Air Force Base, including this building, as a National Historic Landmark. And yeah, here it is. So here's the building. And you can see the damage from the bullets from the planes are still clearly visible, and they've left those in place as a reminder of what happened. All right, we'll talk about Ford Island in just one moment. Before we do, does anybody, Harry, Patty, or Brad, have anything to add about the Hickam site or this part of the battle? This is probably the most famous photo of the damage at Hickam. All right, let's continue on. The next section is Ford Island. And okay, so just to orient ourselves, here's the USS Missouri, here's the Arizona, and then Ford Island is over here. And then again, the Missouri, the Arizona, and Ford Island over here. And there's quite a few things to see here. And as you can see from this map, it's a little ways to, this site is kind of spread out from all these different things. There's also the bow fin, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. So they're spread out. You're going to need probably a car or an Uber or a Lyft to get from place to place if you want to see all these sites. Here's another view, Ford Island. It's the airstrip. And of course, the beautiful Hawaiian geography in the background. And some of the photos of the destruction, devastation here. This was the hangar that they would use to repair and do maintenance on the planes. Here's another version. And look at this, I mean, real-time photo of the fires still raging before they could be extinguished. And just imagine how shocking this was. I mean, there was increasing tensions between the United States and Japan. There's a lot of military activities taking place throughout the world. But at this point in time, the United States hadn't been directly involved in anything. Plus the fact that, you know, Hawaii is a very beautiful, peaceful place. And then all of a sudden this erupts. And today, this is now a museum. They have different airplanes that you can go visit from the World War II era, including this one. You can see here's the control tower in the background. And of course, the beautiful palm trees. A flying tiger. Very distinctive paint job on the flying tiger, of course. And whenever you go to one of these World War II type sites, it's always really cool to go see these planes up close in person. There's the control tower. So someone asked the previous photos, when were they taken, before, during, or after? It depends. So, I mean, if you're looking at a photo like this is after the attack has taken place. There's not really many photos that were taken during the attack. There's some, but like this one would have been taken afterwards. But there were a few that were taken during the battle. Kind of highlight those a little bit later. So good question. Let's see. And then you can go up to the top of the air control tower. There's like a small exhibit up there. It gives you a nice view of the overall site.
I love the seamed stockings, by the way, on that model.
What's that?
The seamed stockings on the I don't know what mannequin, yeah.
Oh yeah. You want to talk about that? People might not be familiar with what you're referring to. What's the
Oh yeah, well, a lot
significance
of
of that?
people born after this era are probably not familiar with the fact that hosiery had these seams, and one of your dressing tasks was to always make sure your seams were straight. And one of the silk became, because hosiery then was these kind of hosiery were made of silk, became extremely rare during the war. And so women would literally take eyebrow pencil and draw this kind of a seam on each other's backs of each other's legs to make it look like they were wearing proper hosiery. So different ways people coped with the real realities of war, and trying to make life as normal seeming as possible in the midst of such giant disruption.
Oh yeah, there's probably a whole generation or maybe more of people that aren't familiar with this because hosiery is to a certain degree not as popular as it was back then. And then yeah, even before that, the manufacturing technology was limited and they had to have the seam showing. So yeah, kind of
And
interesting.
making sure your seams were straight was part of your dressing protocol. You just wouldn't go anywhere without making sure that what had been accomplished.
And as someone who's never worn hosiery, I would imagine that would be a challenging task to get right the first time and then keep it that way.
Yeah, that's why it was such a cultural thing.
So, all right, well, thank you. And again, to me, it's really moving to look at these photos and just Hawaii is such a beautiful place. And to think of how much terror was taking place on December 7th, 1941, a real contrast. This was the tower that we just saw a moment ago. All right, let's talk about the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. So there's a lot of things to see at the Pearl Harbor site that maybe aren't directly related to the Pearl Harbor attack itself. They kind of cover the whole entire war, so to speak. So you can really learn a lot about World War II in general, not just the December 7th, 1941 events. And this is the TripAdvisor review page for the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. I really love the TripAdvisor site. I don't submit reviews myself, but if you're familiar with Yelp, what Yelp is to restaurants and things like that, TripAdvisor is to tourist sites. And so I like to go there and just read what people's opinions are of these sites and look at their pictures, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see here, it's really highly rated, 4.5 stars. That's a very high rating for TripAdvisor. One of the principal Pearl Harbor historic sites, our unique interactive museum, is located in the battlefield hangars of the historic Ford Island, which were attacked by the Imperial Japanese Navy on December 7th, 1941, the beginning of World War II, et cetera, et cetera. And then this is interesting. So this is one of the historical exhibits. And similar to the buildings we saw at Hickam, where they left the bullet impact damage intact, they've done the same thing here for these windows. You can see in the line of fire, look up at the glass windows on these hangar doors. They are pocked with bullet holes from the Japanese attack on December 7th, 1941. You are standing right where machine gun fire raked this hangar. No place on Ford Island was safe. Although the primary target of the Japanese Navy were American warships, Japanese pilots also tried to knock out as many aircraft as possible, both military and civilian. And then here's a view of the damage. You can see the bullet holes here. A stark reminder of what happened. And no doubt some of these bullet holes ended up passing through the windows and hitting people that were inside the building and either injuring or killing them. And then they also have an interesting exhibit about Amelia Earhart. She doesn't have a direct connection to the Pearl Harbor battle, but she does have a connection to the Pearl Harbor site. So let's talk briefly about Amelia Earhart, really fascinating American. So she was born in 1897. She disappeared on July 2nd, 1937. It's presumed that she died. She was a famous pre-World War II visitor to Pearl Harbor and also a famous pre-World War II aviator. She was one of the first women to obtain a pilot's license. She did so in 1923. She was the first female to have a transatlantic flight, so from between North America and Europe. She was also the first person, man or woman, to fly solo from Hawaii to the mainland US, and she did that in 1935. And she had, of course, her world travel around the world flight attempts in 1937. So that's Amelia Earhart. And so here is Amelia Earhart's flight path. And start off here in Oakland and then go through Miami and Brazil and Senegal. So Amelia Earhart, when she disappeared, she was trying to fly around the world. And she was actually on her way to Hawaii, but unfortunately she did not make it. And so they have exhibits and things related to Amelia Earhart's flight. Because we're focusing on the Battle of Pearl Harbor, we'll talk more about Amelia Earhart at a later date, but interesting that connection she has to the Pearl Harbor site. And again, she was the first person, man or woman, to fly solo from Hawaii to the mainland US, and she did that in 1935. And here is one of the Japanese airplanes that was used. And they have a lot of exhibits with placards that will tell you about all the different things you're looking at. They have a lot of items on displays. You can really get a sense of what it would have been like to be involved in this battle. This is a large mural. And this gentleman, who's one of the docents, is pointing out some of the things that are taking place. So this is a really interesting mural because it gives you the perspective that one of the Japanese pilots would have had as they were flying around Pearl Harbor. You can see here the ships all lined up and the airfield at Ford. Here's the tower that we saw earlier. So a really great vantage point from this mural. And then there were different types of planes and bombs that were used during the attack. So let's talk about these. So the first one is dive bombers plunge towards their targets. What a dive bomber does, it flies along kind of on a horizontal line, and then at some point in time, it dives downward and it'll unload a bomb that'll basically follow the path of the plane's trajectory. And it's a way to accurately get the bomb to the target. Now, the plane at some point in time peels off and doesn't continue the trajectory, but the bomb does. So plane flying horizontal like this, it starts to make its dive. It releases the bomb. The bomb continues on and hits the target. Then the plane does like a 90 or 120-degree angle and then goes back upward. So that's a dive bomber. And there's also these Japanese Zero fighter planes. They were really there to protect the planes, the bombers. So the bombers are going to do most of the damage, but the Zero fighters are going to be accompanying them, and they can attack any of the American fighters that might land or take off to prevent them from interfering with the bombing. And the Japanese Zeros can also do some attacks on the ground. They can fire bullets and things like that. Then there's these high altitude formations, and they can target the inshore battleships. So ships that are in the harbor, they essentially fly along a horizontal line and then drop their bombs this way. And this is just different ways of attacking. And then you have these torpedo bombers. And so this is the third way that they could attack. So these planes fly usually low over the water. And then at some point in time, they drop their bombs. The bombs land in the water, and then they sail through the water beneath the surface and have a torpedo strike on the ship. So the Japanese employed all three of these different types of bombing methods: torpedo bombers, high altitude bombers, dive bombers, high altitude bombers, and torpedo bombers. And then along the way, they also had the Japanese Eurofighters accompanying them for protection. And then Sword of the Samurai, designed as the ultimate dogfighter, Mitsubishi Zero was unbeatable. So at this point in time, this Japanese aircraft was the most technologically advanced airplane in the Asia Pacific region. The Americans didn't have anything that matched it. Some aircraft are so famous they have entered popular mythology. The aerial equivalent of a samurai sword, the Imperial Japanese Navy's nimble A6M0 was the terror of the Pacific War. It became a legend. So at this point in time, the Americans didn't really have much that could counter or go toe-to-toe, so to speak, with the Zero. Now, later on, they did, but at this point in time, they did not. So the Japanese had a big tactical advantage from that standpoint. And here is one of the planes. It's one of the most famous military aircraft in history, the Japanese Zero. And there's another view. And then some technical specifications. As I'm going through, Harry, Brad, or Patty, if you have anything to chime in with, feel free to do so. All right, so the Pearl Harbor site, World War II info, especially in the Pacific theater. So they have a lot of things to see here that are related to either World War II in general or the Pacific theater, not just December 7th, 1941 things. So here's the Flying Tiger. This plane came after Pearl Harbor, essentially, for the most part. They were used a little bit beforehand. It has the famous paint job of the mouth with the shark's teeth. And you can see the very distinctive image here.
Yeah, I'll just
Warhawk.
I'll just throw in the the Chinese were actually looking for help before Pearl Harbor because the Japanese were fighting in China from 1937, and they contacted a retired American Air Force officer and pilot by the name of Claire Chennault, and he went to China with the idea of trying to help the Chinese develop their own Air Force. And so he actually got permission from Roosevelt, and this was done secretly because it was before the attack on Pearl Harbor, to recruit American pilots and air crew to develop an air force for the Chinese. Now, it took them a while to get going, so they actually didn't get into combat until after Pearl Harbor, but within 2 weeks or something. They had been training in Burma, and one of their most famous pilots was a guy named Gregory Boyington, who later became known as Pappy Boyington of the Black Sheep Squadron. But he got his start in the Second World War with the Flying Tigers, and then went back to the Marines, and was fighting in the South Pacific later in the war.
So it was probably a big help, Harry, that they were already kind of starting the process of setting this up, even though they hadn't actually seen any.
That's right. They were in the process of getting going, but it was done in secret before America entered the war. Of course, once the war started, they kept going and were eventually incorporated into the regular Air Force. But those planes were actually flying with American pilots, but as technically as part of the Chinese Air Force.
Yeah, just I really like these the cool paint jobs on the Flying Tigers. All right, and then they have other aircraft. So this is a training aircraft. So you wonder, like, how does someone become a air pilot? Well, they have training aircrafts like this, and not all of them, but usually the more experienced pilot will sit in the back, and the trainee pilot, or the less experienced person, sits in the front. There's dual controls, and it's kind of like, if you can remember back to when you had driver's ed, if you went through such a thing, there's someone there to accompany you, show you how everything works. And then some other aircraft from the World War II era. And they're set up in these dioramas. You can see how things would have worked, or how they would have interacted with people and things like that. Here's one of the mechanics maintaining the planes. You can see the marker over here, the hero of Midway about 6 months after Pearl Harbor. And here's a bomber. Our friend Deirdre did a great talk on the Battle of Midway a couple of years ago, I want to say, or maybe a year and a half ago. It's on our YouTube channel if you want to check it out. And then you have a bomber crew. So again, the opportunity to see all these different types of planes that would have been used during the war, not just the Pearl Harbor attack. This plane is...
I wonder if Harry has any comment. Some of the comments last night were talking about various relatives that people had who were gunners, waist gunners, tail gunners, etc. on these planes, and it came up that these were highly lethal positions. I wonder if Harry could add anything more to that.
Yeah, I'm not, real technical about all the bombers, but there were, I know the B-17 had a little pod underneath where a guy would sit, and it had to be a small person, because they wouldn't, a larger guy would not fit. And it was a very precarious position. But yeah, the guys who flew the bomb, I mean, all the pilots had to have incredible courage, because yeah, the technology, as Robert mentioned, is not what it is now. And flying during the Second World War in any capacity was dangerous.
Okay. But these gunner positions were mostly in bubbles, right? So they were kind of uniquely exposed among the people in the plane.
Yeah, well, on the bigger bombers you would have, but yeah, that position especially on the B-17, but you would have other gunner positions which were where you were well inside the plane. So it wasn't everybody handling a gun, but yeah, those guys especially were in a precarious position.
Yeah, because I had a cousin who was killed as a tail gunner over Europe. And somebody else had mentioned a relative who was a waist gunner, and that would be like mid plane, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
thanks.
This is an interesting plane because they actually just discovered this a few years ago, and they brought it to the Pearl Harbor site. They have information, so they restored it as much as they could and brought it back. So this plane crashed, and then they found it in the jungle, and then brought it to Pearl Harbor. And they have exhibit on the Tuskegee Airmen, African
So
American pilot.
I would just mention something here. So
Sure.
the Tuskegee Airmen, this was a program that was set up at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama to train Black Americans to be pilots, which they had not had the opportunity, military pilots, which they had not had the opportunity, and were pushing for going back to the First World War. Um, it's a reminder that the U.S. military is segregated between black and white, and opportunities for Black Americans that wanted to serve were very limited. And the Tuskegee program was able to train over 900 pilots, many who served in Italy, flying the P-47s and eventually the P-51 Mustangs, and they would paint the tails red. So that's where they became the Red Tails, which people may have heard of. There was a movie made about them. Anyway, it's a reminder about the situation of the U.S. military during the war.
Okay.
Yeah, and that also touches on Doris Miller. In the Navy, the Black members in the Navy were only allowed, I think, in steward and mess positions. Is that correct?
Yeah,
So
for the most part, yeah.
yeah, so Doris Miller, which some people noticed in the scene last night, he wasn't actually a trained gunner, but during the heat of the attack, when the people manning that gun were wiped out, he just spontaneously took over, and he was greatly recognized in the aftermath of that. Believe now there's a ship named for him.
Yeah, they're building an aircraft carrier that's named in honor of him.
Okay, yeah.
And then not just men were involved in the war effort, of course. So we have Rosie Riveter. And so this part of the exhibit talks about how a lot of the war materials during World War II, the planes and the tanks and the jeeps and guns and all that stuff were manufactured by women, because the men, a lot of them are all off fighting. So interesting part of the exhibit about that.
I have a slightly different poster highlighting women. It's Women of America, Joan of Arc saved France, America needs you. So it's an actual historic poster that I've had for years. So
Oh yeah, oh that's cool. And then there were also women that were pilots, the WASPs, Women Air Force Service pilots. They were typically transporting the planes from location to case. So you figure America, they're building all these planes. They have to somehow get them to the battlefields and airfields around the battle areas in both the Pacific and in Europe. And how are they going to do that? So there were a lot of women that were actually transporting the planes, which freed up men to focus their attention on the fighting. So
Yeah,
the WASP.
it's interesting. This was actually a run by the civilian government. They weren't actually technically in the military. They didn't get veteran status until 1977. Um, and when they put out, the call for people to volunteer, 25,000 women applied to become WASP pilots, and they only had 1,100 positions.
Wow.
And they would do the transport from the factory, to the air base where the plane was going to be used, or taken into battle. And they would also tow targets where actual ammunition was used to shoot at the targets to train anti-aircraft guns. And about 38 of those 1,100 women died during the war. Probably mostly in accidents. But one woman was actually lost on a ferry mission, and her body was never recovered.
Yeah. So yeah, big sacrifice and contributions made for the Wasps.
And Robert, this is Brad. One of the things that the women talked about in their later writings was that anytime one of them died, they had to take up a collection to send the body home to the family. I mean, this is how far the military wasn't caring for them.
Wow. Okay. Well, thanks all of you. All right, let's continue on. This is the Dolittle Raid, so they have information on that. So the Dolittle Raid took place a few months after Pearl Harbor. Aircraft carrier USS Hornet. It gets as close as it can to Japan, and then these American bombers take off, attack Japan, and then end up splitting off. This is a really fascinating event. We'll talk more about it maybe at a later date. It kind of deserves its whole separate program. But suffice to say, it didn't really do a lot of damage to Japan, but it was a big morale booster in the U.S. The fact that America was able to attack Japan so shortly after Pearl Harbor, and then also too in Japan, it really raised a lot of fears that, oh gosh, America striking capability is a lot closer than we thought it would be, and they end up pulling a lot of their military forces closer to Japan to kind of protect the home island, so to speak, which really benefited the Americans in the military front. So the Dolittle Raid, a really important historical event that takes place a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. If you want to learn more about that, you can do so on your own because we have to continue on Pearl Harbor. Here's actually a photo of the planes getting ready to take off. Look at how packed they are on the aircraft carrier. At this point in time, these types of bombers can't really land very easily on an aircraft carrier, but they could take off from them. They made quite a few modifications, et cetera, et cetera. Harry, I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add about the Dolittle Raid, because I know you and I've talked about this a few times before.
Yeah, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt really wanted to do something. And the problem with the regular aircraft carrier and the regular aircraft was that they didn't have enough range to get, your aircraft carrier would have to be so close to Japan, it would be attacked and sunk. So I think it was a Navy guy that figured out that these B-25s could actually take off from the from an aircraft carrier, but they would have to land. The idea is that they would have to land in China, and one of the planes got diverted and ended up in Russia. The Russians held it for a while. I think they kept the plane, but the crew was able to eventually escape. But the rest landed in China. A few of the pilots were captured by the Japanese, but most of the crew, there were 16 crewmen, 14 got back to the United States, including Dolittle himself. And the Chinese allies of the United States actually protected a lot of those crewmen. The Japanese launched an incredible sort of retaliation campaign against the Chinese because of the Dolittle Raid, killing some 250,000 civilians and 70,000 Chinese soldiers. So the Japanese were furious, and um, it 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 kind of pushed Japan's um, interest in attacking Midway because they realized they were vulnerable to this kind of attack, which turned out in America's favor because of the victory at Midway.
And Harry, didn't they have to like strip these bombers down to like nuts and bolts in order to both get enough fuel in them to make the range and also to still be able to take off from these carriers?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They had to put extra fuel to be able to launch them, and they actually launched a little bit sooner than they wanted to because of a Japanese fishing boat that they were worried might uh, alert the Japanese military to their approach, and so all the planes were pretty much lost because they landed very close to the water or crash landed in China. Doolittle thought he might get court-martialed because they lost all the planes, but he actually received the Medal of Honor for his actions. Somebody asked about the date, but that is correct. It was April 18th. So this is what 5 months after Pearl Harbor.
Mhm. Yeah, less than 5 months, more like 4.5. And incredible bravery because number one, you're risking the aircraft carrier, which is a very valuable commodity by sailing that close to Japan, and then also the pilots. I mean, gosh, this before the internet and all that kind of stuff, and satellites, and be able to fly off and kind of going into the unknown really required a lot of bravery. So we'll have to do a separate program on the Dolittle Raid someday. And then one of the things that's really interesting about Pearl Harbor is just seeing or hearing of the memories of individual participants. So I thought this one was really striking. This was Jack Holder, Pearl Harbor survivor. He said from his time at Pearl Harbor during the attack, my most vivid remembrance was, God, please let me don't die in this ditch. So he had dove in a ditch to take cover from the air attack. And his most vivid memory was, God, please don't let me die in this ditch. But he did end up surviving. And then another thing that you can go see is the USS Balin Submarine Museum and Park. This is a little ways away. This also has a really high rating on TripAdvisor. This museum was actually just recently refurbished in the past few years. So if you went to Pearl Harbor previously, this museum is much, much larger than it was back then. And it has a lot of exhibits inside. There's kind of two parts to this site. One is a museum. Oh, there's a little bit of an echo from someone. Let's see. Harry and Brad and Patty, I'll mute you guys for just a second. If you have anything to chime in with, just unmute yourself. There's a little bit of an echo, which sometimes happens. Sometimes on Zoom, if you can have several hosts and there's no problems, and every once in a while there's like an echo sound for some reason. I don't know what causes that, but anyway, Harry, Brad, or Pat, if you have anything to chime in, just feel free to unmute yourself. So here's some parts of the museum exhibits. And then here's a really interesting thing. So if you've never been on a World War II era submarine, it's something you should check out. I've been on a few myself, and it's amazing how small these ships are, but also at the same time very lethal. And this is the USS Balin. Here's a view from another angle. There's also World War II era submarines in, I think it's Muskegon, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, Chicago, Illinois, a few other places. If you know of any others, you can mention that in the Zoom chat or the Q&A. All right, so this is the USS Balin. It was called the Pearl Harbor Avenger. And the reason why it had that name is because it was launched on the 1-year anniversary of the attack, December 7th, 1941. It was 312, or is 312 feet long, 27 feet wide, and it had a crew between 70 and 85 men. It fought in the Pacific Theater. It sank numerous Japanese ships and opened as a museum in 1981. It's named after this type of fish, which is long and narrow. I'll show you some pictures of the inside in just a moment. Here's the gun, one of them. And of course, kids always get a kick out of stuff like this. Let's see, this young girl and this young boy checking out the gun setup. And then you go downstairs. So this is the thing that I always thought was tricky, because they can close these hatches off if they need to. Like for instance, if some water starts coming into the submarine for some reason, they can close off the hatch. It's really tricky for me to go through these because I'm tall. So at the same time, you have to duck. You also have to put your legs over this portion of it. So you really have to be coordinated. Maybe eventually you get the hang of it, but I've hit my head a number of times visiting these different World War II submarines. Be on lookout for that. And then here's the guns where they put the torpedoes in. And again, these submarines of this era, not very large, but extremely deadly and potent. They did a lot of damage on all different sides of the war during World War II. And at some point in time, I was going to actually stream the movie Das Boot. I actually saw it a long time ago, and then I watched it again when COVID started. I was like, oh wow, I should screen this someday for our group. So I'd like to do that at some point in time, maybe in the spring, because I think a lot of people either have not seen it before or haven't seen it in a long time. But that's a really excellent movie about the German submarines. All right, let's talk about the attack itself. So this is the planner of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto, a very well-known figure during World War II. He'd actually visited America, and he was opposed to Japan attacking the United States. He thought that was a bad strategic idea. But that being said, he's a military guy, and he takes his instructions from higher up. And so when he's tasked with attacking Pearl Harbor or some type of related type event, he's in charge of making that happen. Because in the military, if you get an order, just like at your job, if you get an order from the boss, it's not really your call to agree or disagree with it. You pretty much have to carry out the instructions. So that's what he does. And this is interesting. This is actually a Japanese map showing the route that the task force took. So here's Japan right here, of course. And on November 26th, the fleet took off, this carrier task force. And you can see they make steady progress. So here they are, November 30th, December 1st, December 2nd. Now, this is long before satellites. And also, the Pacific Ocean is massive. And so the Americans are kind of looking out for activity, so to speak, and so are some of other countries. But because the Pacific Ocean is so vast and military activities are so limited, the carrier task force goes undetected. And then December 3rd, December 4th, December 5th, and it's moving into position. And then here it is during the attack. And then after the attack, which takes place right here, the task force, it initially goes north. The thought was it had to get as far away as possible from Pearl Harbor because they were really concerned about getting a counterattack, the Americans. And at this point in time, aircraft carriers are extremely vulnerable. And then eventually, when it kind of gets away from flying range of Pearl Harbor, it then makes its way west and heads back towards Japan. And they arrive back home on December 23rd. And then here is the attack path. So there were actually two different attacks on Pearl Harbor. There was a first wave and a second wave. You can see the first wave, 49 level bombers, 51 dive bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, and 43 fighters. They come in from this way, from the north, and attack these different sites. And there's a second wave. There's a second wave a short time later, 54 level bombers, 78 dive bombers, and 35 fighters. And not all of the sites were right at Pearl Harbor. For instance, Wheeler Field and Canoa Field. And this is just an infographic kind of showing some of the planes and again, the routes they took, et cetera, et cetera. There are a few photos taken from the Japanese fleet during this time. So here's the crew of one of the aircraft carriers, and they're cheering on the plane here. You can see the Japanese flag. And then here's another picture from the Japanese side. All right, let's talk about the timeline. So the Pearl Harbor timeline. So 6:10 a.m. is when the first attack wave got airborne off the aircraft carrier. They had to fly quite a ways to get to Pearl Harbor. Remember, they have to kind of like Perry was talking about with the Dolittle Raid. The Japanese have to stay a fair distance away from Pearl Harbor to avoid getting a counterattack. So it took about an hour and 45 minutes for the planes from the time they took off, so they can kind of coordinate in the air and then head towards Pearl. And then at 8:54, so about an hour after the first attack began, the second attack ends, and that lasts for about an hour. And then things were wrapped up by 10 o'clock. And this pivotal moment in world history lasted 3 hours and 50 minutes from the time the attackers got airborne to the time the attack ended at Pearl. Now, this is actually an airplane or an aerial photo from the Japanese side. So you can see down here, if you look closely, it's got Japanese characters in the bottom right. So one of the pilots actually took this photo. He didn't whip out his iPhone, though. He had the camera mounted on the plane. But really interesting to see, okay, so here's the island we looked at earlier. Here's the targets, the battleships. You can see some of the planes flying overhead. So a really incredible, striking photo, especially because of the clarity of it. And then there was someone asking earlier where the photos that I was showing taken before, during, or after the attack. Well, it depends. You can see this one is taken at the time of the attack. There's explosions taking place and things are blowing up and all the smoke. And then here is Ford Island. And then here's the ships. So these are some of the main targets. The Japanese were hoping to attack the American aircraft carriers and catch them sleeping, so to speak, at Pearl Harbor. But they actually were not there. We'll explain why that was a little bit later. But you can see these different battleships that are here: the Maryland, the Tennessee, the Arizona, the Nevada, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, all stacked up there. So this was a real big, important staging area for the Navy. So ships that were traveling around the Pacific would come here to get restocked or have maintenance done or repair work, things like that. And then Harry is going to talk about these gentlemen who played an important role in Pearl Harbor. So Harry, it's all yours. Take it away.
So there were actually some American pilots that got off the ground. There's some debate in historical circles about actually how many. So, some historians think as many as 14. The problem is that the situation was so chaotic that it's been difficult to track down. These five in this photograph were known. And from left to right, they are Second Lieutenant Harry Brown, Second Lieutenant Phil Rasmussen, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, Second Lieutenant George Welsh, and First Lieutenant Lewis Sanders. And I'm going to talk about the three in the middle. Philip Rasmussen is sometimes referred to as the pajama pilot. These guys had been out late at night on the Saturday night before the 7th, and got woken up, after very little sleep. So the story with Rasmussen was that he jumped out of bed, and before he put his uniform on, he put on his 45 pistol belt and then ran out to get into one of the airplanes. And he got out. he got into a P-36 and took off with several other pilots. He had a 50 caliber gun and he shot down a Zero, but then he was attacked by other, Japanese Zeros that were in the area. His plane was badly damaged, fell into an uncontrolled plunge into the clouds over the mountainous terrain. After passing through the clouds at 5,000 feet, he regained control of the aircraft, returned to Wheeler, where he landed with no brakes, no rudder, or tail wheel. And men who saw the plane estimated he had about 500 bullet holes in that aircraft. So the fact that he managed to survive was somewhat miraculous. He stayed in the military, retired as lieutenant colonel in 1965, and died in 2005. Now, the next two, Kenneth Taylor and George Wheeler, their story is in, I think they're in the Tora movie, right, Robert?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So their story is more well known. They had been playing poker late at night at the officers club at Wheeler, and so they went to sleep about 6:30 in the morning and woke up at less than an hour and a half later at 7:55 to the sounds of the low flying Japanese planes and gunfire. They put on they also don't have the uniforms. They put on their tuxedo pants from the previous night, and they decide that they're going to drive to an auxiliary field at Haliewa, because they think that the Japanese might not know about that airfield or might not be attacking it yet. So they find two P-40s that they can take off with, and they get up in the air and start attacking Japanese planes. They're outnumbered about 6-1, and Taylor shoots down two dive bombers and damaged another. When they run out of ammunition, they go back to Wheeler to get more 50 caliber ammunition, and they manage to get off the ground again, even though the other officers were trying to dissuade them from taking off, because the situation was just so incredibly dangerous. Taylor headed for a group of Japanese aircraft, ends up in the middle of a formation of about 7 or 8 Zeros. Japanese rear gunner from a dive bomber fired at Taylor's aircraft. One of the bullets came within an inch of Taylor's head and exploded in the cockpit. He was wounded. Welsh shot down that dive bomber that had injured Taylor. And together they were able to shoot down, several Japanese aircraft. Taylor would go on, both would survive the war. Taylor would actually become a consultant on the Tora movie, that would show later, and he survived the war by quite a bit. Welsh would become a test pilot after the war, and he would die at a fairly young age, in an accident. In 1954, Welsh died following a crash in a test flight in a North American F-100 Super Sabre. He was 36 at the time that he died.
You bring up a really good point, Harry, because so many pilots died in either testing these aircraft or transporting them. It wasn't a lot of the pilots got killed. It wasn't necessarily in combat operations. It was doing kind of auxiliary type activities. It takes a lot of testing to get an airplane functioning, and dangerous profession back then.
And these two were actually cited by the U.S. military, a little bit after Pearl Harbor, as the first two American heroes of World War II, and they were both awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest medal after the Medal of Honor.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Anything else to add on this section, Harry?
No, that's good.
Okay. All right. Well, let's continue on, and we'll talk about Battleship Row. So this is where a lot of the damage took place, and probably the most famous kind of overall section of this area. And this is the position of the ships. And so you can see they're all lined up. It made it a little bit easier for the Japanese because they were in such close proximity. If you're wondering why they weren't spread out, well, because this is where the Navy base is. So just kind of the way it was configured back then made things a little bit easier for the Japanese to attack them. Let's go through some of the ships. The USS California was one of them. It was a battleship. It was took direct hits of 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes. It sunk, and 102 military personnel were killed, 98 members of the U.S. Navy and 4 members of the U.S. Marines. Miraculously, it was actually returned to service. The ship was, after it was sunk, it was returned to service on January of 1944. So about 2 years later, the USS California returned to service. Here is the battleship before the war. And here it is during the attack. You can see the large plumes of smoke. Here it is after the battle. And you can see how low it is in the water. Pearl Harbor is deep enough to be able to accommodate ships, but not so deep the ships would just completely sink. And so you can see that's the case here. You can see kind of the scale of the figures in the boat, and the ship is just barely above the surface of the water. And then here's another view. You can see all these different kind of debris floating in the harbor, all this incredible amount of smoke. When you look at these photos, there was the air tower that we saw earlier, the control tower over at Ford. All right, let's talk about the USS West Virginia. This also was a battleship. It was hit by 2 bombs and 7 torpedoes. It sunk and killed 106 members of the United States Navy. It also, though, was returned to service, and that took place about 2.5 years later on July of 1944. To go back to this ship, so what they do is they, during this time after the battle, they start working on the ships, and they have underwater divers essentially patch up the ship. Then they pump the water out and kind of refloat it, kind of giving the oversimplified version. So that's how the ships are able to return to service, because Pearl Harbor is not super deep. Here's the ship, and these little dots here are people. So a very large ship. This one, interesting, has airplanes, so it has these cranes that could drop the plane off or pick it up and retrieve it, things like that. Seaplanes. So you could take this, put it in the water, the plane could take off from the water, then land, and then the crane could scoop it back up. And this is one of the more famous photos of Pearl Harbor. You can see the ship burning. And then you have a crew here. They're essentially risking their lives to go in here and see if they can rescue anybody, because at any point in time, this could all explode. So when you see people doing activities like this, they're really putting their lives in danger to see if they can save anyone else.
Robert, in one of those previous photos of the West Virginia, I'm not sure if people were actually able to notice that all those little, what looked like debris in the water were actually heads of people trying to escape.
Mhm.
Can you? Yeah, I don't know
Yeah,
if people
right here.
know. Yeah, all around. They're actually, yeah, the water was full of people in various states of injury and well-being trying to escape these burning ships and burning diesel oil, which covered a lot of the surface too.
Yeah, because you don't want to stay on the ship, because that's the target that's getting attacked, and also things are exploding on it and stuff like that. So thanks, Patty. Appreciate that. Yeah, and again, this is one of the more famous photos of the Pearl Harbor attack. I frequently see this image used in different media contexts. It was originally a black and white photo. Different people, though, over the course of time have colorized it, which makes it even more kind of striking to see all this smoke and devastation. Another colorized version. And again, kind of a similar story here. You can see the outline of the ship here, and the water line. It's supposed to be kind of more up here. And let's talk about this gentleman. This is U.S. Navy Captain Mervyn Sharp Benion, and he was killed on December 7th, 1941. So he was the captain of the ship. You can see here his gravesite. And then we were talking about Dory Miller, above and beyond the call of duty. So Dory Miller was a mess attendant, and the ship gets under attack, and he instinctively just goes to one of the anti-aircraft guns, which he hadn't been trained how to use, but he figured it out and started shooting. And by most accounts, he actually shot down at least one airplane, one Japanese airplane. So pretty amazing that this guy who was not trained to shoot these guns could jump into action and do some damage to the Japanese. This is a cartoon of him.
What adrenaline can do for a person.
Yeah. And Dory Miller, not sure where he's from. He grew up not too far from where I'm at. He was from Waco, Texas. And then his story and act of bravery was really used as a kind of patriotic call of arms. This is actually a portrait. I don't know, Harry, if this one is still on display, but this image used to be at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, which is where Harry's tour is taking place next Sunday. And unfortunately, though, Dory Miller died during the war. He was on a ship that later sunk. So he unfortunately did not survive the war. And as mentioned earlier, there's an aircraft carrier that's being built, and they're naming it after him and his historical marker, recipient of the Navy Cross. And here's the aircraft carrier. It's going to be called the USS Doris Miller, CVN 81. And I think that was announced a couple of years ago that they were doing that. And if you're in Texas, you can visit the Doris Miller or Dory Miller Memorial. It's in Waco, Texas, which Waco is halfway in between Dallas and Austin. All right, let's talk about the USS Oklahoma. It was a battleship. It was hit by 5 torpedoes. It was capsized and lost, and 428 people were killed just on this one ship. 415 members of the U.S. Navy, 14 members of the Marines. Someone might be wondering, like, well, why did these ships fight back, or why was there so many people killed? Well, they did fight back, but there was an overwhelming force of Japanese that attacked. It was a surprise attack, so they did fight back as best they could, but because kind of the nature of the attack, the fact that it was surprise and it was a kind of overwhelming force, inflicted a lot of damage. And here's the Oklahoma before the war. Again, another large battleship. And the sinking of the Oklahoma. So you can see where all these different torpedoes hit it. And again, the torpedoes is where the plane flies overhead. It drops the bomb. The torpedo bomb sails slightly beneath the surface, which was a new design for the military. So one of the reasons why the Americans got caught off guard is they didn't believe that torpedo bombs could be used at Pearl Harbor, because the previous torpedo bombs, when they would drop them in the water, sank quite a ways before they continued on their course. But the Japanese, through technical innovations, they figured out a way to have the torpedo bombs drop at a much lower depth beneath the surface. So they were able to use them at Pearl Harbor, which the Americans were surprised to discover. And you can see when the first warning attack was sounded, sailors aboard the USS Oklahoma took the aircraft batteries, and the ship went to general quarters. Shortly after the attack in Pearl Harbor began, torpedoes were seen approaching the USS Oklahoma. One portside machine gun opened fire, but the force of the explosion to oil water thrown up by the first torpedo stopped it, etc., etc. And then here's what happened to the ship. So it's facing this way at 7:56 when the attack began. The torpedoes hit the side of the ship. And you can see here, this is a good graphic because it shows you that the water at Pearl Harbor, it's deep enough to accommodate the ships, but it's not so deep that if it was to sink, it would completely be underwater, like, say, the Titanic. And it gets struck by several other torpedoes and it starts listing on its side. And then eventually it, for lack of a better term, it keels over, so to speak. And so you can see the ship is fully functional at 7:56, and 12 minutes later it's capsized. So a pretty incredible turn of events.
Robert, there was one scene in the movie last night too that I'm not sure people understood is connected to this. That when the commander of the aircraft carrier force, they were doing target practice, and the American ships, the American planes weren't doing very well actually hitting that target. That's what that was. That was sort of emphasizing where the U.S. was in terms of this kind of torpedo bombing versus, then it's juxtaposed with the success the Japanese had.
Yeah, that's a great point, Patty. The Americans hadn't really practiced it all that much. They weren't really planning on attacking anybody, but the Japanese had. And so, yeah, early on at this point in time in the war, they're much more proficient at that. So that's a great point. And then some photos of the destruction here. You can see here's where the ship, we heard that term keeled over. That's where that comes from, because this is the keel or the bottom of the ship. And so when it keeled over, the bottom is on the top. The top is on the bottom. And so a lot of people killed during the attack. A lot of them have really interesting stories. So this is Father Schmidt, and he was down below the ship when the attack takes place. And because one of the reasons why so many people were killed in this particular ship is because it sank very quickly, or it capsized very quickly. And so there's a lot of people that are trapped here underneath. And so the father and many other men were in that situation. He ends up helping 12 people to safety. So you can imagine the ship gets overturned. It probably disoriented everyone. That's being filled up with water. They're being trapped, and there's different openings that they can try and get out of. And while this is all taking place, they told him to go first. He didn't go. He's like, let me help some of these other people that are injured. But then eventually the water overcame him and he got trapped and died. But there were 12 men that he helped lead to safety before he was overcome by water himself, and he did not make it out. So really incredible act of bravery, Father Schmidt. And then here's a couple of other gentlemen, Francis Flaherty and James Ward. And Harry, Patty, or Brad, anytime you want to chime in, feel free to do so. These are actually brothers that were, ironically enough, at Pearl Harbor all at the same time. The military doesn't do this as much anymore, from my understanding. If there's people that are related, they usually tend to kind of split them up more often because they're worried about something like this. But these are the brothers, Malcolm Randolph and Leroy Barber. And it's just, to me, really touching looking at these photos of these individuals. And gee, they lost their lives during this attack. They're all so young. They have their whole lives ahead of them. And unfortunately, they were killed during the attack.
I think this issue came up very soon after that, and it was also accompanied by the whole idea of if there's only one surviving member, which is what that Saving Private Ryan plot is based on, that member shall be removed from harm, so that a family will not have lost all of their sons in a given.
Yeah, and I mean, look at these photos. They showed up at Pearl Harbor that had the photos taken December 5th, 1941.
Yeah, it's amazing the proximity to the actual event, but yeah, It's so many things that we don't think of that come into the consideration of what wartime means, which is one reason I love this organization, because you do tie so well the cultural phenomena with the actual historical events.
Oh, thanks, Maddie. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, these events like this, they're really complicated. There's a lot of different facets and aspects. So this is the ship, and you can see, okay, so, yeah, a lot of it's sunk. So eventually they try and restore as many of these ships as possible. You can see the sailor working on this one. And then here they are, they're going to try and turn it upright. So they have Navy divers would go down below and try and repair the damage by essentially sealing the holes from the torpedoes. And then they can eventually try and turn the ship right side up and then do further repairs if necessary. So you can see that's what all the apparatus is here. This is the thing that's going to be used basically to turn it back over on its side. So just really incredible that they would be able to do this. And so that's what he's working on. All right, let's talk about the Arizona. It's the most famous ship at the Pearl Harbor site. Most famous because the Arizona was a somewhat famous battleship before the attack took place. It's where many of the lives were lost. And it was hit by 4 bombs. It exploded and was lost. And 1,177 people were killed on the Arizona, 1,104 from the Navy and 73 from the Marines. And a shout out to all of our friends in Brooklyn, New York, because that's where the USS Arizona was made, at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And this was one of the more famous battleships before World War II, the USS Arizona. It was named after the fact that Arizona had just recently become a state. So Arizona became our 48th state here in the United States in 1912, and the Arizona was commissioned 4 years later in 1916. And so here it is, sailing before the war. Here it is in New York. See the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan sky. I mean, look at this incredible photo. You can imagine people lining the docks here and looking out from tall buildings to see this famous warship travel by. It also had these seaplane launchers. So I'll give you a sense of the ship. And then here's kind of an aerial view and a side view. Look at the size of this ship. 608 feet long. So that's a football field is 100 yards or 300 feet, at least the non-end zone parts. So the length of 2 football fields, 106 feet wide, 34,000 tons. And then look, your chances of surviving the Arizona were very minimal. So look, there were, at the time of the attack took place, 1,554 men stationed on the Arizona. 1,177 were killed. So very few got off the Arizona alive. And many of the ones that did make it off the ship alive suffered very serious injuries, burns in particular. This is a artist recreation of the attack. So one of the reasons why the Arizona was so deadly is one of the bombs hit the ammunition storage of the ship, which ended up causing it to explode. Or the boiler, hit the boiler, sorry. Here's the famous photo after the event taking place. It's a little bit blurry, but you can again see all the smoke and the fire. And this is another one of the more famous photos from Pearl Harbor. And again, look at all that smoke. Look at how thick that is. I mean, a lot of people that would have been there would have died from smoke inhalation, wouldn't have been able to get fresh oxygen, regardless of whether they were inside or outside. And here's what Patty is mentioning too. Look at the people in the water. They're trying to get away from the ship because the ship's under attack, and they're thinking, "Gee, if I can get away from the ship, I won't be under attack." But of course, there's oil and gasoline and stuff in the water that's burning. There's things collapsing, explosions, smoke, etc., etc. Many of the people that dived into the water, of course, would have already been injured. And if you have any kind of cut on your arm or leg or face, the last thing you want to do is come in contact with salt water. But if you're trying to survive, that's what people had ended up doing. All these photos from Pearl Harbor attack were in black and white, as far as I know. The ones that are color have all been colorized many years after the fact. And you can see the hull collapsing. And then this is the clock. So when the ship sank, the clock stopped at 8:09. And then here's the ship after it sunk. So again, because Pearl Harbor is not super deep, there's still a portion of the ship above the water. So the Navy came through and eventually cut off this kind of top section, so to speak, of the ship. Metal was in great demand, so they could at least take this off, probably recycle it, and then kind of get it out of the way. Here's the ship after the attack. So, I mean, look at the devastation and destruction done to this big, giant 600 plus foot long warship, all by planes, attacking planes. And this is the United States Navy Rear Admiral Isaac Campbell Kidd. He was the highest ranking officer that was killed during the Pearl Harbor attack. He just happened to be on the Arizona when the attack took place. And you can see he was from Cleveland, and his hometown newspaper, the Cleveland Plain Dealer. U.S. bombs rip Japanese battleship. Tokyo troops win Luzon. Admiral Kidd, Clevelander, killed in Hawaii. And he's buried at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. If you ever get a chance, you should check out the Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis. It's a very moving sight. You can see Admiral Kidd there. And this is a touching story. The ship's band was killed at Pearl Harbor. So ship's band killed at Pearl Harbor. All 21 musicians on Arizona died, passing ammunition from below to guns. They get music award. This is them performing shortly before the attack. Here's another photo of them right before the attack. So the musicians at this particular instance, they're trained as musicians, but their kind of secondary job is to help with the military activities of the battleship functions. And so when the battle took place, they stopped their musical duties, of course, and were focused on helping the ship defend itself, but they lost their lives. And just really eerie to see these photos of them performing just a few days before the attack. And then if you're curious, if what happened to parts of the Arizona ship, if you ever go to Phoenix, you can actually visit the signal mast from the USS Arizona. So this is in Phoenix, Arizona. And then let's talk about the USS Arizona Memorial. So again, the TripAdvisor rating, see really highly rated, 26,000 plus people. The 180-foot memorial honoring the 2,388 Americans who died during the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. And so this is the outline of the ship, this horizontal image here. Again, they cut off the top section. They needed the metal and just to get out of the water and stuff. And the memorial part is kind of perpendicular over the top of it. You have to take a boat to get here. As you can see, it's surrounded by water. So what you do is you take these boats, it pulls up the dock, you go inside the memorial, walk around, etc., etc. It's a real pilgrimage site for a lot of members of the American military. So you can hear this is a more recent aircraft carrier, and the men on deck are forming the word freedom as they pass through the Arizona site. And these members of the Navy paying their respects. Likewise, the Marines. Here's a diver checking things out. And again, this white section, the memorial, built over the top of the remaining wreckage of the Arizona. The Arizona is still leaking fluids like oil, interestingly enough, even after all these years. And then because the ship's below water, it's deteriorating. So I saw an interesting documentary the other day on the Titanic and how that's really also deteriorating. So you can see kind of how it's looked before and after. It's really kind of falling apart. But that's what happens to metal in seawater. Here's the section of the ship that's still above water. You can see it's rusting metal.
Robert, Jan was saying that the 7 windows on each side and the top of this memorial represent a continual 21 gun salute.
Oh, yeah. That's a great point. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. Thanks for adding that in. And of course, it's a popular tourist attraction. It's run by the National Park Service. There's that control tower at Ford Field that we saw earlier. And then you go inside and it has the names of the personnel that lost their lives. Oh, we're getting quite a bit of static again. So Patty, Harry, and Brad, I'll mute you just temporarily, but if you need to chime in with anything, feel free to do so, of course. So yeah, the names of those that lost their lives. And a lot of people come here to pay their respects, both civilian and military. And then as far as the timeline of the attack in other places, so we talked about the fact that the planes took off from the Japanese ships at 6:10. The first attack began at 7:55. You got to remember back then communication was much slower than it is today. So it was around 8:52 a.m. Washington, D.C. time was 2:22 p.m. that people announced that the attack was taking place. So it's interesting if you know anybody that was alive during World War II, if they remember what they were doing. I asked my mom, and she was on a Girl Scout walk when the news came over that the Pearl Harbor site had been attacked. And of course, they ended up canceling the rest of the walk. But it's interesting hearing her story. And then again, the American losses: 4 battleships sunk, 4 battleships damaged, 2 other ships lost, 8 other ships damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, 159 aircraft damaged, 2,335 members of the U.S. military killed, 1,143 members of the U.S. military wounded, 68 civilians killed, and 35 civilians were wounded. Japanese losses: 4 midget submarines sunk. A sailor was captured from one of those. A midget submarine was grounded. Oh, the sailor that was captured is actually from that. 29 aircraft destroyed. Harry talked about some of that. 74 aircraft damaged and 64 of the air crew were killed, primarily. Now, a big thing that happened was there was no third wave. So Yamamoto was thinking about, he had prepared to have a third attack. And he thought that this could potentially be the knockout blow, that it could do a lot of additional damage to the Pearl Harbor site. They wanted to go back and maybe attack like the ship and aircraft maintenance facilities more. There was a lot of fuel that was being stored at Pearl Harbor. They thought they could attack that. But Yamamoto, decides against doing that. He was really, really worried about losing his aircraft carriers. So he thought, you know what, this was a big decisive victory for us. Let's call it a day, so to speak, and move on. It's don't want to risk a counterpunch, so to speak, from the Americans and risk losing this battle. So there was no third wave. A lot of historians have really debated what would have happened if that had taken place. And then eventually, the 6 aircraft carriers that Japan used in the attack on Pearl Harbor, all 6 of them were later sunk by Americans and allies. And then this is interesting in as far as like the turning point of the war. So in the years after Pearl Harbor, Japan produced 62,000 aircraft. But you can see that's much less than the United States was able to crank out. And of course, there's also several other countries that are producing war materials during World War II, besides the United States, but look at the disparity in the aircraft production. So that really ends up playing a key role in the events after Pearl Harbor. And this was the main, or one of the main targets of the Japanese was the American aircraft carriers, but all 3 of them were not at Pearl Harbor. So this was a really key moment in the battle, the fact that the Japanese weren't able to sink these, because at this point in time, aircraft carriers were a rare commodity. The United States didn't have a lot of them. And the USS Enterprise was 200 miles west of Pearl Harbor. The USS Lexington was 500 miles north, and the USS Saratoga was in San Diego. Of course, again, at this point in time, they don't have satellites. The military intelligence wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it was today. And so they didn't know that the aircraft carriers weren't there. It just so happened they were not. And then this was the aircraft production after the battle, very significant disparity. And then we talked about this during the movie last night when we were screening Tora, Tora, Tora. Yamamoto in the movie famously says, "I fear all we have done is awaking a sleeping giant," with a terrible resolve. And he didn't, historians don't think he actually said that line like as an exact quote, but he's certainly most likely was probably thinking in those kind of terms because he had visited America. He was not in favor of the U.S. going to war, or the Japan going to war with the U.S. But that being said, he's tasked with coming up with the battle plan. But an interesting quote nonetheless. I mean, even though he might not have said those exact words, it really kind of is interesting that it kind of captures the kind of essence, so to speak, or perhaps what he was thinking. What about Patty? You were talking about this yesterday before the film. Any kind of additional comments on the quote from Yamamoto?
Well, I was pointing out that, yeah, you had mentioned it was possible that he thought that, but there's no evidence that he said that. And my point was simply, but, it makes excellent propaganda. I think Roosevelt and many of the military leaders understood in advance that there was some risk of this all happening, but the country was not in a place where it could be mobilized. And so much of what we've talked about here really went into, I mean, imagine how we could have mobilized ourselves to be that prepared for war and to wage war for the next 4 or 5 years without this sort of shock where Americans were immersed in this, how dare they? And then suddenly you've got all this shipbuilding, all this. Again, I'm reminded of like the Spanish Civil War, the amount of advancement, industrial advancement and medical advancements that were made. Because at the same time you're beginning all this building activity, both of planes and ships and everything else, but you also have all this salvage activity and experimentation that's going on at Pearl. So, I mean, we were able to mobilize ourselves in so many directions based on the shock and the anger. So, yeah, skillful use of facts that make good propaganda. It's not just one side uses propaganda and the other side doesn't. It's like everybody uses what they have to appeal to the highest, or what is considered to be the highest and best instincts of the population under these particular circumstances. And that hasn't changed a great deal. I mean, several people have mentioned things, how this relates to 9/11 so many years later. But it is that thing of rage that can create positive mobilizing and energizing effects. But also in retrospect, you can see where, ooh, that kind of rage isn't necessarily the best decision-making tool.
Mm-hmm. Oh
So
yeah.
it can be good and it can be bad, you know?
Oh yeah. What about Brad or Harry? Anything from your perspective up to this point? All right.
There
Oh,
was a
go ahead.
question about why bodies weren't recovered from the Arizona, and it's a little complicated. A lot there's this kind of old tradition in the Navy, of course, when ships are lost in the deep ocean, there's almost no way to recover those bodies, right? Because they're so far down. So the feeling over generations has been, well, that is their tomb, right? That is their final resting place, right?
The
On
sea.
on the ship that they were serving on. Now, the Arizona is obviously not that deep. They could have recovered the bodies, but they're in a war now. And the thought about recovering those bodies doesn't come until months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And by that time, there's this growing feeling that, well, this is sort of a naval tradition, right? That the sunken ship is considered their final resting place. So that was the prevailing feeling. And now, apparently, men who were serving on the Arizona at the time of Pearl Harbor, they can have their ashes interred on the ship
Oh really?
at the
Wow.
memorial. Um,
Wow.
so, and that about and I think they can also have their ashes strewn in that area if that's what they want. But they have to have been serving on the ship at the time of Pearl Harbor, and apparently some men have decided that that's what they wanted with their remains.
Wow. Yeah, because so many of them would have lost friends and colleagues during the attack. I didn't know about um, that part of it, Harry. So, okay. Thank you. Anything else from our panels before we continue on? We have a little bit more to go. We're in the home stretch, but have a little bit more to go. All right, let's jump ahead and oh, and then here's war poster after the attack place really mobilizes Americans. It's interesting to read newspaper accounts of the attack on Pearl Harbor, or for anything for that matter, any kind of historical event. Japan strikes all over Pacific, bombs Hawaii, Guam, Philippines, takes heavy toll. Japan declares war against U.S. I thought this was interesting that the New York Times had this pretty detailed map describing to people all these, because I think at this point in time, Hawaii is not a state. No one had really heard of Pearl Harbor for the most part, and kind of giving people a sense of where this is all at, what's taking place. And of course, President Roosevelt comes and delivers a speech to a joint session of Congress, and where he famously says, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, one of Roosevelt's most famous quotes. And if you go to the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., one of my favorite places there, the first section of his speech, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. And if you go to the Pearl Harbor site, you can also visit USS Memorial. Again, as you can see, highly rated on TripAdvisor. Since opening in January 1999, the Battleship Missouri Memorial has attracted more than 8 million visitors from around the world with a fascinating tour experience showcasing the USS Missouri's unique place in history. And here is the Missouri, the Mighty Mo, the home ship of my uncle many, many years ago, not during World War II, but afterwards. And one of the reasons why it's here is because when the ship retired, it plays a big historical significance in the Pacific campaign of World War II. At 904, the Japanese representatives signed the instrument of their country's surrender on this ship when it was anchored in Tokyo Bay. If you go visit the site, they have a big statue of Admiral Nimitz, Chester Nimitz. There's the big, beautiful ship. And just to give you a relation, so here's the Arizona that we saw earlier. Here's the Missouri. And so the Arizona kind of symbolically really symbolizes the start of America's involvement in World War II. And in the Missouri, because it's where the surrender terms were signed, really kind of represents the end of the war. And so interesting that these two sites are so close to one another. And more scenes of the beautiful Hawaiian geography. The ship is known for, among other things, its big guns. So look at these people and how small they are compared to these big giant guns. And then these are some of the projectiles that would fire. So imagine being somewhere and having one of these land on top of you or near you. And so if you get a chance, don't just check out the Arizona Memorial, make sure you visit USS Missouri. There's another one of the shells. So imagine something like this being hurled several miles by the Missouri. That's what a battleship does, among other things. Anti-aircraft gun. The bridge. Down below. Much more roomier than the bow fin submarine we saw earlier. Here's the briefing room. Here's the bunks. So imagine these accommodations. Triple bunks. I'm not sure how they decided who got the top, bottom, or middle. Someone asked that when we did the program last year. And then the kitchen, big ship like this, got a lot of mouths to feed, so you're going to need a lot of food and a lot of cooking. And so the mess, look at all these loaves of bread. A mighty grocery list. So here's what the Missouri needed when it was functioning. Over 240 gallons of milk, 500 gallons of coffee, 210 dozen eggs, 200 pounds of bread, 500 pounds of vegetables, and 1,000 pounds of meat products made, 5,000 crew rations every day. And another aerial view. And eventually Japan surrendered. The paper from August 15th, 1945. And this is the spot on the ship where the surrender terms were signed. Over the spot on September 2nd, 1945, the instrument of formal surrender of Japan to the Allied powers was signed, thus bringing to a close the Second World War. The ship was at anchor at that time in Tokyo Bay. In Tokyo Bay at 9:04, September 2nd, 1945, Japan's foreign minister signs the instrument of surrender by command in behalf of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government. 20 minutes later, World War II was over. And you can see the signing taking place here on the Missouri. It was no accident that the Missouri was chosen. It was one of the more important and famous battleships in the American fleet. And America really wanted a show of force. And so while the signing is taking place, all these airplanes are flying overhead to give people that were any doubt about the American military might, because at this point in time, Japan did not have many planes that could still fly, but America did, and so they have a big show of force during the signing ceremony. It's a really interesting photo there. Here's the Japanese delegation. Here's the signing taking place. Douglas MacArthur was proceeding over the activities. Here's the instrument of surrender. And then, of course, celebration takes place throughout the world, including in America. Shortly thereafter, this famous photo was taken. There's a recreation of it in sculpture form at the museum outside the ship. A popular photo / selfie spot, as you can imagine. And there you have it, the Pearl Harbor Memorial. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, our good friend Harry Phillips, he's hosting a tour of the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. It's going to focus on figures of World War II. Harry, someone might have joined us late or maybe watching a recording of this programming. Can you tell us about your tour once again?
So we're going to be visiting the National Portrait Gallery and looking at portraits of Americans from the World War II era, which will include, as you can see, a number of military officers, but also we'll be looking at civilian figures, political figures, a couple of sports figures, and that will also be in the President's Gallery, talking about Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, the two presidents who were commander-in-chief during the war, and the 8 presidents that served in the military in some capacity during the war after Truman, before they became president.
Okay. If anyone's watching us live, I'll send out the link with the information on where Harry's tour is taking place. It's posted on our Washington, D.C. History and Culture meetup site. Harry, just for people, where are you meeting at for the tour?
We're going to meet in the main courtyard, which is in the center of the building, and I'll be wearing a red baseball cap.
Okay, excellent. Then what about Harry? Any final thoughts on Pearl Harbor before we have a few more things to wrap up with? But any final thoughts before we call it a close?
Just one little piece of information. Of course, the Medal of Honor had started in the Civil War, but during the Second World War, 472 medals were awarded. 15 of those for actions at Pearl Harbor, and most of those had to do with men saving, other men. And of those 15 medals, only 5 of those men survived.
Oh, well. Okay. Well, thank you. And what about Brad and or Patty? Any final thoughts before we?
Several people have talked about the process and years involved in making the Arizona Memorial, which Harry did point out it was dedicated on Memorial Day of '62. But some interesting stories. Someone had reminded that Elvis, in his, I believe it was the mid to late 1950s, and he was in his first rush of popularity. So he did a benefit concert for that, which drew all of the younger children of military personnel, and it was a very loud concert. Elvis was quoted as saying that he was glad that it was so noisy because some of his earlier songs he didn't necessarily remember all the lyrics to, but nobody could tell what he was singing. So just
Wow,
again,
I didn't know that about Elvis and the Pearl Harbor connection. That's fascinating.
yeah, I don't remember the exact date that it was, but it was, part of that whole public effort to make this thing happen. And of course, Elvis was the hot performer of the time. So that, screaming phenomenon had already begun and did play its part in the Arizona Memorial.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's incredible. What about Brad? Any final thoughts before we wrap it up? Did your parents ever say anything about the attack on Pearl Harbor, like what they were doing, I remember you saying yesterday your dad actually was stationed in Hawaii afterwards.
Yeah, but that was probably in 1943.
Hmm.
Uh, he 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 and my mother enlisted or joined the Navy after the war had started, um, and got their training and then did their duty. My dad's pictures of Pearl Harbor were usually ones of them on the beach or something. And in fact, until a book came out about it, his whole story about island hopping at the end of the war uh, was kept close to the chest. These people saw and were told things that they were told never in their life to talk about to anybody, and a lot of them honored that.
Oh yeah, even after the war ended.
Yes, and not just the reluctance of military people to talk about their experience, but things that actually were kept secret for a long time, basically because the American people probably would have gone bananas had they known some of it.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. So okay, well, thanks, Brad. Thanks, Patty, and thanks, Harry. So if you joined us late, this program is being recorded. It'll be on our Washington D.C. History and Culture YouTube channel. I probably won't get a chance though to load it until tomorrow, but I'll send the link out once it's available, along with the link for Harry's um, upcoming tour at the Smithsonian. Harry, any other events or things you'll be doing in the near future after your Smithsonian tour?
No, I have a couple more ideas for museum tours, but they're in the working on them phase.
Okay, all right, no problem. We'll be on the lookout for that. Again, hopefully you can join Harry at the Smithsonian in the near future. And let's see. So let me do this. If you're watching us live, I gotta stop the recording.